In this video, we're going to go back and look at parallel lines in a little bit more depth. In previous videos, we've seen that if you take two parallel lines and cut them by a transversal, that they form 8 angles. And we have seen, or we have at least surmised, that the 4 acute angles are all congruent to each other, and the 4 obtuse angles are all congruent to each other. What we're going to do in this video is we're going to look at these relationships between angles again, and we're going to introduce a little bit of extra vocabulary so that we can describe these angle relationships when we're doing proofs or just generally talking about diagrams and angles in those diagrams. All right, so let's go back and look at our diagram. So here are 2 parallel lines cut by a transversal. So the first relationship I want to talk about is like this angle and this angle. All right, so I like to think of these as kind of the northeast corners of the 2 intersection points. So I've got the northeast corner of that intersection point and the northeast corner of this intersection point. All right, and because those 2 angles kind of correspond when you think about that translation between them, we are going to call these corresponding angles. All right, so that relationship between angles, they are corresponding angles. And it's not just those 2 angles, it's the other 3 pairs of angles. So the 2 southeast angles, the 2 southwest angles, and the 2 northwest angles would all be corresponding angles. Okay, so that is a very common type of angle that we want to talk about. Another one that is very common is this relationship right here. So you can see once again that these 2 angles are congruent to each other. And the term we're going to use to describe them are alternate interior angles. Okay, let's break down that name so that you can see how the relationship is kind of baked into the name here. So alternate, think about something alternating between 2 things, like a traffic signal that's alternating between red and green. It's going back and forth between those 2 states. And these 2 angles, one of them's on the left-hand side of the transversal and the other one's on the right-hand side of the transversal. So that's what alternate means. It means they're on different sides of the transversal. What about the word interior? What does that mean? Well, interior means inside. And so what we do is if we look at the 2 parallel lines, we can also see that these 2 angles are inside the part of the plane defined by those 2 parallel lines. So that's what I mean when I describe these 2 angles as alternate interior angles. They're not the only alternate interior pair in this diagram. So for instance, if I took this out and replaced it with this angle and this angle, you can see that these are also on alternate sides of the transversal and they're both interior. They're on the inside of the 2 parallel lines. So this is also an alternate interior pair. But most of the time when we're talking about alternate interior angles, we are talking about this one and this one. And the way you can recognize this alternate interior pair when you're looking at a diagram is to draw the sides or to imagine drawing the sides of the 2 angles. So for instance, these are the 2 sides of the top angle, and these are the 2 sides of the bottom angle. And so if we draw all 3 of those sides, it's got this Z shape. So when you draw this Z, the 2 angles formed by those 3 sides form an alternate interior pair of angles. You will very often hear me in diagrams referring to this as the mark of Zorro. So for those of you who don't know, Zorro is a Hispanic hero. He's a movie and comic book character from the early to late 20th century for the most part. There was just a Netflix series about him just last year. But Zorro was, he had a sword and he had a whip and he had a horse and he was just an awesome guy running around fighting injustice and political corruption in California when California was owned by Mexico and kind of getting transferred over to the United States. But one of Zorro's big signature moves is taking his sword and slash, slash, slash. He would make these 3 slash marks and it would form a Z in, a tapestry or a curtain or some guy's jacket or something. And so it would be the symbol that Zorro had been there. So that's why I will refer to this shape as the mark of Zorro. But when you look at it in a diagram, anytime you can draw a Z like that, you're going to see alternate interior pairs. All right. There are a couple other relationships between angles that are not as important as these two, but sometimes we'll talk about it. So without drawing any extra text, I'll just kind of describe them. So for instance, if we had this angle and this angle, how would you describe these angles? Well, they're on alternate sides of the transversal again, but this time they're both on the outside of the 2 parallel lines instead of the inside. So can you imagine, based on that, what a good term to describe this pair of angles are? Well, awesome for you if you said, well, why don't we call them alternate exterior angles? And that's just what we would do. Another relationship that happens sometimes that we'll want to talk about is, for instance, this angle and this angle. So looking at them, you can see that these are not congruent angles, as opposed to every other angle pair I've pointed out so far in this video, because this is an acute angle and this is an obtuse angle. So they're definitely not congruent to each other, but they are supplementary. If we took this acute angle and this obtuse angle and put them together, it would be like taking that angle. Since I know this angle is congruent to this angle, and these 2 angles are supplementary because they form that straight line, therefore, these 2 angles, if you put them together, would form a straight line. So these are also supplementary angles. And we would describe these, they're interior angles, but they're not on alternate sides of the transversal. So if we want to talk about an angle pair like this, we might describe them as same side interior angles. And if we've ever identified angles like that, we would know that they were supplementary. So that just gives you a little bit of an introduction into how we would describe angle pairs. Obviously, there are a lot of other angle pairs because there are 8 angles and we can mix and match them any way we like. There are lots of interior angles and vertical angles when you look at those. But the 2 most common that we're going to use when we're talking about parallel lines are the corresponding angles and the alternate interior angles. We're going to use these quite a lot when we're doing proofs of parallel lines.